Hey everyone, hope you're all doing well. Sorry for the lateness of the video. It's been a crazy week. I'll spare you the details. Let's get underway. This is going to be quick, I hope. What do we take away? The first week after break, you've already submitted stuff for this past week. I'm not going to talk about that at all, but I want to sort of tie together a couple of loose ends and address your critiques from last Friday about this sort of transition from the archive stuff that we looked at the first half of the class to algorithmic data society stuff that we're looking at the second half of the class, that we've already gotten into algorithms and the everyday kind of stuff that you read for this week. For last week, we're really making that transition. And the key here, I think what the transition really is how both articles are focused on how do algorithms and large-scale text analysis and sheer volumes of data, how do those things affect archives in a way that we haven't really studied as much when we were more focused on traditional archives. Both articles are clearly focused on how do you analyze large historical archives and the consequences of digital archives, whether born digital stuff, so produced recently, or digitized stuff, things that have some sort of physical analog existence that are now being digitized, which is a much more complicated process than you might guess. And we won't get into those details here, but we will get into the implications of digitization in general. So there's two things I want to emphasize in terms of the main points. You all really got the main message, I think, pretty clearly. So I want to highlight a couple things that I didn't see as much that I think are interesting, and most importantly, address the very good questions you had. And I can't get to everyone's questions in a reasonable amount of time, so we'll just sort of hit highlights here, and I've tried to group them a little bit for efficiency. In terms of Lauren Klein's article, I want to point out how she's emphasizing two different kinds of silences. So we've talked about archival silences ad nauseum before, so we're done with that. You understand the general principle and the dangers and so on and so forth. But I want to point out here how she's focused on two different kinds of silences. And one, which is maybe the most obvious because it's just so visual, which is the silences of visualization. So she's got all these arc diagrams that she talks about, and she's talking about the algorithmic ways that they are made, that they are necessarily made in an algorithmic way, because you can't just manually do these things. Well, you could, but it would take forever, and you wouldn't necessarily learn anything. So it's not something people would really do. But when you have the appropriate tools and maybe a little bit of technical or coding knowledge, as she does, you can do this sort of thing in a relatively short amount of time. And you get a sense from the visualizations of what potential silences might be in the archive. And I think this is a really fascinating complement to the way we talked about archives previously, where we didn't talk about how do you see them, right? We talked about Hartman's sort of historical fiction and imaginative ways and poetic ways of understanding and bringing to life a kind of silence, but also the dangers of speaking for someone else in very particular context. So the idea of just kind of representing them from a sort of data visualization point of way, representing the silences, is a really interesting way, I think, of trying to make researchers more aware of what's not in the archive by virtue of the things that they can see most easily. And so to sort of visualize the things that you can see easily, and then ask yourself sort of what's in between these things, like what's not being represented there, in a way that if you were just to go through the archive and read the stuff, sit down in the reading room, flip through all the pages, and try to understand what's not being mentioned, it's going to be much harder and much more time consuming than to try to do it in this sort of algorithmic way. So silences in visualizations is one of her main things. And the other one, which is mentioned more towards the end, is the silences of the technical work that goes into creating a digital archive and making it searchable and making it visualizable. And I'll talk more about it at the end, because some of you had some really great questions on that point. What is James Hemmings an example of in Klein's article? I think both articles kind of speak to this. Obviously, only one of the articles is about James Hemmings, but it's really, both of them are addressing this key idea that it's easy to think that because you can text search a full archive, like Jefferson's archive, it's easy to miss stuff because you think there's so much there and everything has to be there. So where is James Hemmings? This is Jefferson's cook, who was going to be the White House cook, but ended up committing suicide, and so on. You know the story, it's all in the article. Where is Hemmings in the digital record versus the past? What role did he play in history, which was significant? I mean, any historian who studies Jefferson or anything about Jefferson knows the importance of James Hemmings to Jefferson and his life. What is the role in the past of James Hemmings versus his presence in the digital archive? They're completely different things. Now, the role of Hemmings in sort of history, which is how historians have talked about the past, is very different from his record in archival sources. And it's very different from how it might be represented in digital sources. So now we have these three very different things to think about. Again, just focused on this one person, James Hemmings. We can see these very different sort of constructions of him. There's the history, what people have said about James Hemmings. There's the digital sort of visualization of where he appears, which is virtually nowhere. And then there's history, what he actually did and his role in a way, shaping the life of one of the most, arguably, I guess, significant people in the country's history. Very, very, very different things that we have to sort of inquire about in different ways. People like James Hemmings, enslaved people, marginalized people. We've talked a lot about these kinds of groups over the semester so far. A lot of them are addressed, when they're addressed at all, are addressed so indirectly that they actually are invisible in the record. Even when you have a full text database, all the words and all the letters are digitized or OCR'd or somehow searchable, they're still invisible, which makes them in a way even more invisible than they were, because you knew they were sort of scattered around and not quite as represented in the archive as they were in the historical past. But you knew there was a lot you weren't seeing at the same time if you were someone using the archives. But now as somebody who's been told, hey, you have full text of this entire archive, you can search it and find everybody who's mentioned and so on, but actually you can't. And that's obviously the case of James Hemmings, but Klein's article isn't just about Hemmings, obviously. It's about this phenomenon, right? People who were continually marginalized and sort of written out of the record, not just for archival reasons that we've already discussed, but just the way someone like Thomas Jefferson talked about them in this very diminutive, sort of abstract, third-person kind of way, that their presence, even in a fully digital archive, becomes suppressed in a way more so than it would be if you were reading the letters. And so that's a very different way of thinking about sort of the possibility of digital archives, which we tend to think about as expanding, almost infinitely, our ability to sort of understand what's going on in the historical record, because we can search for so many things. We can visualize the textual relationships and the relationships between letters and names and so on. But it also makes it easier to miss stuff. Okay, so I think you got that point. Arc diagrams feature prominently in Klein's article, but I hope you recognize that is just one of any kind of representation. The point is really about sort of how do you use representations and how do you use data, textual data, algorithmically to see things that you couldn't even see if you were sitting there reading in the archive. For Laura Putnam's article, she talks about the dangers of search and transnational research. Geography matters, right? That's clearly one of her main points. Archives were meant to be national. She has this really nice introduction to the article about the history of the archives, which we've seen a long time ago, and how it was really formed to create national identity. When you think about how important sort of archival documents are, it's easy to lose track of it or not think about it. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, let's just take American history. What if these archives, these documents in archives are central not only to our laws and everything else, but how other people see us, our national identity? What if these things didn't exist? What if we just had some cultural memory of these documents, which is highly malleable? We didn't have the actual document. It burned up in some fire or whatever. What if we didn't have that archive that said, this is the document, these are the words, and we just had some sort of vague recollection or interpretation of what the ideals about them? Very, very, very different worlds, right? But to have the actual words on a physical document that we preserve and say, this is it, right? This is the archive. This is our identity. But those grow out of geographical context, right? What happens when you don't have access to the archives. You don't have access to the physical space, and you sort of miss out on that context, or you don't know a particular place very well that you would have known much better if you had to physically go there and interact with people and so on. There's one particular quote early on in the Putnam article I want to address. The place-specific learning that historical research in a pre-digital world required is no longer baked into the process, the research process. We make rookie mistakes. I just want to disagree with this because, yes, technology makes it easier for people to make rookie mistakes, I suppose, but that's been happening forever in terms of different kinds of history, different kinds of people doing history, people with different levels of training doing history. That the technology makes it easier for people to do crappy history really isn't a critique of the technology per se, or a critique of archives or archival interfaces or so on. So I'm not sure, no, I am sure that I definitely don't agree with her on this point. But I do agree with the larger sentiment that the place-specific learning that historians usually engaged with before they went to an archive and spent a lot of time sort of digging around through stuff physically, there is a consequence to not necessarily having to do that. Understanding the local context, you can do that even from afar, right? This is, I think, the easiest criticism of her argument is just as it's easier to get to sort of archival stuff from afar, from an international context, it's easier to do research on particular places from afar, right? So it's actually, the thing that enables the bad history also enables you to not do it, or to remedy it. But there is something that's lost that she doesn't, I don't think, particularly elaborates on, which is that archival knowledge is very specific. And the people who have that, the archivists, have a history of the archive and what's in it and how things relate to each other that you will never find in any finding aid, even if you're there in person. And you will never find online in any sort of digitized way. You have to go and sort of tap into that, institutional memory via the archivists and the people who have worked there, often for a long time, or have talked to people who have worked there for a long time and understand how things have been put together and changed and what's there and what's not there and the politics of that particular archive and so on. And you get a lot of stuff as a historian or any kind of researcher in an archive from archivists that you would not be able to find on your own. And to me, that's more important than sort of the geo-specific stuff that she's talking about in the article. It's that local archival knowledge, not so much the geographic knowledge or the ability to understand the archive. You can get that from historic graphical sources, from secondary sources. You can do a lot. You might miss some things, but you're always going to miss some things, and let's be real. But the idea that you can't sort of learn enough in a transnational context to make up for the fact you're not there, I don't think that's true. But the fact that you're not actually talking to an archivist in person and being there and building a relationship and building trust. We talked about this with community archives and their relationship with mainstream archives and so on. That personal connection really matters. And even you could do that over Zoom or email or whatever, but it's not the same as being there in person and having this person say, I'm going to show you this box that I don't show to most people because I don't trust them to mess with it. And here's stuff that's totally relevant to what you're doing, but it's not in the finding aids, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of like their secret little thing. This is how archives really work. There's stuff that's just not always available to the same amount of people. And this does happen. You'd like to think that archivists are not quite as, personal about their artifacts, but yeah, they are. Historians are very personal about their stories that they write and tell. Archivists are very personal about the stuff that they save, and so on and so forth. This is what humans do, okay? So that loss, I think, is very real. But even a bigger concern in Putnam's article is, quote, slightly later, early on in the article, I didn't write down the page number, doesn't matter. Even if you, like me, deeply appreciate the insights that the cultural turn brought us, this should perhaps give you pause. There is a real world out there. The totality of sentences that have ended up in print no way corresponds to the proportions of past human life. And I think this is really one of the most important points of the Putnam article, is to recognize that even though we can search more stuff, we have more information, the amount of words that go into the historical record, whether it's born digital, which is a lot more stuff recently, or digitized stuff from the past, that's just such a tiny, tiny, tiny little thread of this sort of massive, massive tapestry of the past. And it's easy because we can tap into so many more things now, digitized sources, to think that we're getting sort of a bigger picture of the tapestry, when it's easy to lose track of the fact that we're just reading these few words and constructing whole worlds out of them. And that's something that's easier to lose track of when you have way more information, abundance of historical information. So this isn't a digital concern, right? This is an archival concern. It grows out of large-scale digital text searching and digital research methods, text mining, topic modeling, arc diagrams, macro reading or macro analysis, distant reading. So it's a good example of a problem that has always existed, right? Understanding things in context. But it's becoming almost a new kind of problem simply because of the sheer scale, right? The issue here isn't that there's a new problem because of technology, the fact that the real world tends to be different than the historical record. People have always kind of known that. But the fact that we have so much more of the textual record, so much more of the historical record that we can sort of connect and search through and so on, it almost makes the problem a different kind of problem because it's easier to lose track of. Olivia asks, why is increased access to more documents through the digital archive a disadvantage or limitation? That's obviously one theme of both articles. And hopefully I already answered that question just now, is that it's too easy to get lulled into a sense of abundance and think, look at all this stuff that I have, and stop being critical about the things that you don't have. And I think both the articles in very different ways make those points pretty well. Increased access not only means more searching and being more limited by the archival apparatus, but you become more dependent on archival works of classification and tagging and establishing of relationships. And the errors that we've already talked about in this class in terms of classification and establishing relationships, epistemology, they're not totally different, but in a way they're harder to see and harder to recognize because there's so much more data and there's so much more noise that comes out of that data. And we become more and more, the more data we have, the more we become dependent on the metadata, on the way our archivists have described it and cataloged it and classified it and labeled it in different ways, the interfaces we use to get to it. So these problems that we read about towards the end of the first half of the class hopefully are becoming sort of bigger deals in your mind as you start to see how they're being applied to archives. We think we're getting closer to objectivity because we have more and more and more stuff, way more than we've ever had, at once, transnationally, instantly. It's an amazing world. No one wants to go back to how it was, but it does raise new questions in terms of methods and understanding the context of the data that we're getting. Connor mentions that the similarities of these articles is mostly how much of the digitization of archives have helped scholars and historians have easier access. And this is very much true. I think it's something that both of them sort of take for granted. It's kind of a starting point for both of them. So in that sense, I totally agree with you, Connor. But I think the most important point to take away in terms of the similarities is how they're trying to bring a critical perspective to this sense of, hey, look at all this great stuff we have. We must be better off than we were. Yes, but we have to recognize there are, if not new issues, different kinds of issues. There are clearly new issues because of technology. We've already talked about those in terms of interfaces and so on. But some of the older existing issues, because of their sheer scale, become a different kind of an issue. Connor asked a great question in terms of this access. Do the positives of saving time and money outweigh the dangers of archival silence and gaps in the archives? And this is a great question. In the sense of time and money, in a way, yes. I mean, you can do more kinds of history more quickly, and that isn't a bad thing necessarily. But on the other hand, is bad history okay as long as it's cheap and quick? How much does research integrity really matter? Is it better to have a lot of people looking through a lot of stuff? And I'm talking about sort of trained historians, not just sort of people who have no idea how to interpret primary sources, but people who know what they're doing. Is it better for them to be going around looking at a lot of stuff and making connections and making up stories and telling us about the past and creating new interpretations, even if they're missing a whole bunch of stuff that these articles try to alert us to? Is that better than a much smaller number of people taking a much longer time to tell us sort of much more smaller stories that are sort of much more local to specific places? I don't know. There's no good answer to that question. I mean, both kinds of history have value, but they really speak to different kinds of questions. They appeal to different kind of researchers. They appeal to different kind of readers. So I don't think that there's really. I mean, you can see it as a pros and cons kind of question. You can see it as saving time and money, but we get sort of less detail. On the other hand, both these articles really leave out the tremendous amount of technical work that goes into doing their digital scholarship, in the sense of getting data sets, getting texts together, parsing it out, cleaning it up, putting it into tools. Klein describes this a little bit, but she glosses over almost all of sort of the nitty-gritty stuff that's extremely boring, trust me, time-consuming, and absolutely essential. If you don't do it right, if you're not careful, your results don't make any sense, or they're useless, or your methods won't work. So a lot of this, labor that goes into digital research becomes invisible, right? Another one of the visibility angles that she's talking about, in terms of archivists, gets applied to sort of historians or people who are trying to interpret the archive as well. In terms of borders, Connor talks about borders in his post. Yeah, we're both tearing down existing borders, or geopolitical borders for sure, but we're also creating new borders in between information and sources through metadata and through our interfaces and our ways of getting to the archive. Matthew, on a related note, asks how digitized archives can be improved in order to avoid the mistakes of leaving out real-world connections. And I'm not sure that they can be improved to any extent of eliminating the problems. The problems are always going to be there, I think. But two things come to mind in terms of how we can make some improvements. We're never going to get rid of the problem or solve the problem. But two things for improvements come to mind. We read a while ago about transforming, or at least thinking about the relationship between historians and archivists and maybe how they should work together more. I think continuing along those lines is absolutely central. There might be an even further blurring of the boundaries between the historian and the archivist that I think would be very productive for a lot of ways. The other way in which I think digitized archives can be improved is that the archival process, which has largely been invisible. You go to an archive, there's stuff there, there's card catalogs, there's books, finding aids, you look through them, you ask for stuff, you get it. You don't have much sense of how things got set up, but it's mostly in front of you anyway. So you can kind of get a sense quickly by just looking through how things were organized, or talking to the archivist, for instance, how things got organized the way they are. In a digital environment, things are much less transparent, I think, in terms of how the database is set up and how relationships are made and so on. So there's a lot more we can't see as users of interfaces and users of databases. And I think making that sort of more transparent, and again, this gets back to a discussion we had many weeks ago, it is one of the most important ways to sort of improve the way in which we address these issues described in the article, is to make researchers aware of sort of how and why they're seeing what they are. Chris asks, in regards to a Putnam quote about digitally enabled transnational history, Putnam says we think we're more connected to the world, but we're actually more insulated from it because of our digitally mediated access to stuff. What does this mean? What is Putnam really trying to say by insinuating or stating, actually, that we're more insulated from parts of the world? And I think her point here is that all history is local. All stuff happens in a particular place. That means different things in different places, if that makes any sense. And so we need to understand the local dialect. We need to understand why something happened in that place, because had it happened somewhere else, it would mean something else. And as Bobby points out, when you're just doing full text searches, you dissolve the structural constraints that kept history bound to political territorial units. And understanding sort of why you're seeing some documents in one archive and some other related documents are in a totally different archive, that's going to be more apparent to you when you are physically working in them. And when when you know you have to physically go to multiple places as opposed to just sit in front of your computer screen and go to different websites and assume that they're sort of covering a wide geography of stuff. To illustrate this difference, I think Putnam's point can be best illustrated by thinking about the difference between searching a library catalog. You can do this for yourself at UNM. I guess, can we go in the library anymore? I don't know, I haven't tried. Searching a library catalog online versus browsing the shelf. When you search for a book online, a specific book, and you see all the books that come up in the search results, hopefully the one you search for is going to be the top one, but you'll see all these related items on the search page. Those are completely different than what you would see if you went to the library shelf where that book is and you looked at the related things. It's completely different. There'll be a little overlap. I mean, I don't mean to say that there can't be any overlap, but it's almost totally different. Because the way those things were classified in the Library of Congress scheme, that's one system of classification, and the way algorithmically things get generated based on abstracts and metadata and so on and so forth, a completely different system. Bobby mentioned that he found Klein's article to be unnecessarily complex and way too deep in academic double talk. I don't know about double talk, it seems a little strong, but I agree. I think Klein's article makes a lot of good points and is really unnecessarily complicated. I hesitated to actually even assign it because it has this, I think, Rococo style to it that isn't to my taste necessarily, but I think it makes such good points about text analysis, about visualization and silences, and sort of brings the first half of the class into the second half. I thought it is worth it. But I agree that the Putnam's article is much more straightforward, and I think illustrates sort of the major issues in a much clearer way. As a pair, I hope you get a sense of how different people can write so differently about the same kinds of things. Obviously, they have slightly different points they want to make. But in terms of thinking about the pros and cons of a fully text searchable archive and just how you talk about it, they give you a sense of like the vast variety that's available to people who study this sort of stuff. The last point I want to make comes from two different sets of questions from Aaron and Natalie. Aaron asked some very good questions about sort of the archive-scholar-data relationship and asked whether Klein's work or things like it should be added to Thomas Jefferson's archive. Not as his creations, obviously, but should it be part of how scholars study this body of stuff? Should metadata only reflect what is physically present in an archive, or is metadata a tool to find and create uniformity? On the last point, yes, metadata exists to enable algorithmic searching. Absolutely. But this is a great question. Is adding data to the original archive, so archivists that go in and sort of classify and organize stuff, are they contributing or commenting on, or are they changing the archive? Well, they've always been doing this stuff, right? I mean, clearly. Would you consider the past sort of analog versions of what they've been doing, putting things in card catalogs, as changing the archive? Not necessarily. But when they're adding this stuff sort of to the database where the full text of a letter, of Jefferson's letter, and the metadata that describes it, because they become so integrated in the way we access it through algorithmic searching, in a way, those things are becoming much more part of the same sort of archival thing that we're interfacing with. And I think this is really fascinating. How much of this aspect of the archive, the stuff that archivists are adding and describing and cataloging and putting in the database with the full text of the historical stuff, how much of that is becoming really the archive in itself? And how much of that needs to be studied in itself? Especially when you're working at larger scales and those differences really start to matter, right? At what point, when historians are using these sort of digital methods to study large-scale corpora of text, hundreds of thousands of books instead of several hundred books, at what point are historians or anyone, at what point are you studying metadata as distinct from the historical record? I mean, they're obviously meant to be tightly coupled, right? But they're clearly different things, right? Reading novels and then putting them together in your head and saying something about them is a very different way of analyzing stuff than sort of putting all the novels together and saying, okay, computer, tell me what the most common words are, or tell me where you see relationships or similarities between phrases. Those are entirely different ways of studying stuff that give you entirely different results. Now, one hand is more sort of humanistic meaning, and another one is textual analysis. And so, but they're very interesting in their own ways, but they're totally different. And for historians, so that's literature, but for historians who need to know about this sort of geographical context and the historical context that you can't get from the document itself, you really have to know what's going on in the wider world. Where does that interface really start to become problematic? When you don't have a clear distinction between the metadata that you're searching and the full text of a set of letters, for instance. And directly on these points, ending with a question from Natalie, is immersing oneself in context during the research progress, is this unique to the discipline of history? And I think good research in any field, any profession, good research is thorough. Okay, I think we can all agree with that. And part of being thorough is being attentive to context. So in that way, history doesn't have a monopoly on context by any means. But I think being attentive to and thinking through historical and humanistic questions about information, where it's coming from and what the sources are and how they might be biased and shaped and how it fits with other stuff, being attentive, being thorough, and understanding what questions to ask and understanding where silences and gaps and distortions might be are very distinct kinds of awarenesses. And one is more historical, and the second, as you might guess, and the first one is just an interest in being thorough. I do think history provides the best, or as good as can get, in terms of training for understanding context. No matter what field you're working on. You can go and be a mechanical engineer, but there's going to be context to all the stuff you have to think about. And that, the questions you learn to ask as a historian, the way you learn to contextualize stuff as a historian, I think is exportable to literally anything else. It doesn't give you the technical skills to compute, like load limits and, compute structures so they don't fall down, obviously, but to ask questions about why are you doing things this way? Sort of what is the precedent? Why does that exist? How is that being culturally determined in ways that aren't apparent from your day-to-day tasks? I think those kinds of questions are ones that historians focus on and ones that give anybody interested in being thorough a leg up. So yes, to your question. So not unique to history, but history is the best, obviously. Both authors are interested in similar problems of silence, but they have very different interests in context. So building off of Natalie's point, and this is the last thing I want to say, is just to draw your attention to the different kinds of context that these articles are describing. Putnam's talking about the geographical context of sort of how do you understand archives about a place and the importance of understanding that place in order to understand the archives and the stuff that's in them. And I've added to that, or tried to add to that, by focusing on, or not focusing, but by mentioning earlier on, the importance of understanding the archival context of how stuff got to be put where it is and grouped where it is, and why it's not something else. Because just asking those questions helps you think about what you might be missing. So geographical and physical and archival context, that's Putnam's article. Klein is much more interested in the context of data, and particularly hermeneutic context, which is hermeneutics is the study of how do you create meaning out of things, and how do historians make a sense, an interpretation? How do they get a sense of the historical record? How do they interrogate the relationship between the sources and their past? And that everything that Klein is talking about isn't unique to the archive. It's not unique to history. It's not unique to full text searches. It's really about the context of data and understanding the representativeness of what you have in terms of data and the data set that you can plug into a visualization tool, and the representativeness of that with the historical record. So it's almost a more sort of micro context than putting on sort of much larger transnational geographic context. But so this is about scale, and this is the final thing that I want to end with, which is context is important, but there's lots of scales of context, just like we talked about interfaces a number of weeks ago. And I tried to make the point that there's a number of interfaces. There's lots of different interface levels when we think about the archival, apparatus writ large. And so when we're talking about digital methods and full text searches and algorithmic society stuff, as we already gotten into this week and will continue to explore, think about the different scales. We can never lose sight of the fact that there's very different questions, there's very different answers and very different problems at very different kinds of scales. We were talking about society, you're talking about global humanity, you're talking about a particular place or county or school or whatever the situation may be. There's very different things to think about. And I hope these two articles gave you a sense of how different contexts give us different questions in specific ways that we can continue to apply. This is an archive. One last quote to end with. This is an archive that encompasses impossibility, talking about the Jeffersonian archive, and depends on an interplay of scholar, archivist, technologist, and text. And I love this quote because it's obviously totally applicable to what she's talking about, but it's a perfect sort of transition to all the stuff we're going to be reading the second half of this semester, to think about what kind of information do we have about people? Do we save? Do we preserve? That's the archivist part. How do we inquire it? What do we do with it? That's the scholar part. The technologist, how do we access it? Who decides how it gets saved? That's the technologist part. And the text part. So replace text with data, and now we're on our way to the second half of the class. Happy Easter. I'll talk to you soon.